Kyle Thompson.
And I'm Fraser.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And as you can tell, we're joined by a guest again, a returning guest, Fraser Simons. And this time we are reading a bit of fiction again. We're reading The Player of Games by Iain M. Banks. Pretty fun little book, you know. It's not gonna set your hair on fire, but I certainly enjoyed it. What's y'all's take?
I've been a while since I first read this book. I read through the Culture series in order, up until I think Accession, and then I had some life issues where I had to drop off of it. But this is one of the better books in the series, I think. I think as Fraser can attest, it's certainly better than the first book. I guess we can all agree to that, I think.
Yes.
Yeah,
Don't read these series.
Yeah, you don't really get that much out of reading this series in order. Like, there are callbacks, but it's really like it's the kind of like lore hunting stuff that you find on like wiki pages, and that kind of just like very buried in the text sort of like sly references more than any kind of like really meaningful continuity, because a lot of these books are separated by enormous swaths of time. And you see the culture at different parts or different periods in these different books. But the Player of Games itself, I think it is very kind of, or is very much like a novice effort, I guess I would say. Like, it is definitely not Banks just starting out. He's not a complete beginner, but it's also like much more straightforward than most of the books in this series. Like, it doesn't feel like he's really gotten into a lot of like authorial writerly, like, elaboration and experimentation in the way that he goes on to in the next book, Use of Weapons, which is very like, I don't know, it's very much like a novelist's, like, science fiction book, like, very character-driven, very sort of, like, experimental plot structure, all that kind of thing, which you really get in the rest of the Culture books. He keeps experimenting with different styles, whereas, Player of Games is just kind of a straight shot beginning to end, right? And, as I think you were saying, in the prep for this episode, it's kind of like two things happen in each act, and then you move on to the next one, right?
It has a pretty rigid sort of structure where each chapter has like pretty much exactly two things happening, and then on to the next one. Yeah,
it feels like he's writing his 5-paragraph essay before he can move on to weird experimentation.
I could kind of tell that, like, when I was doing up the notes for the episode, like, it was pretty easy to summarize, like, because it is quite linear and such. But I think it's competently written. It was a fine read. Fraser, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I thought that it was, well, for like Kyle alluded to, I did read them in order, and I hated the first one. So when I got to this one, it was like a breath of fresh air. And seeing that improvement, I think it made the book a little bit more endearing to me. Maybe you could see how much he had progressed from the first and second, and it is a lot. The overall book is more enjoyable. There's less tropiness that is really bad. like killing the gays in the first one did not make an appearance in this one, as far as I remember. So that's good. That's progress. And just in general, I think it's really interesting that a space opera, as it's labeled mostly, that I saw anyway, is actually, I think, as far as I classify cyberpunk, is cyberpunk, I think. And really hits on the same stuff that was happening in cyberpunk, which is a reaction to sci-fi, right? That's what the whole movement was about. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the book, I think.
Yeah, it's Yeah, it's good stuff. I think absolutely cannot recommend reading the first book in the Culture series. Pretty much recommend this one though. It's quite good. Before we go on though, and I want to get into why we're actually reading this one, but before we do that, I should throw out a bit of a content warning that in the book some of the theming does circle around sexual violence. Now it's not actually sort of used as a plot point in the book as far as I can remember, but the theming is there. One of the empires involved is a profoundly unwoke society. So if you think you're maybe not up for that, maybe drop out now, because we'll have a hard time not mentioning it as we go along. Having said that, there isn't that much of it, so weigh that up and maybe think about dropping off. But yeah, so Kyle, why are we reading this?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of good reasons to read this book. So I mean, I think a lot of people, when they talk about the Culture series, they talk about Accession as oh, that's the one you got to read, right? That's the really great stuff because it's got all these cool characters and there's all this interesting stuff going on and it's really exciting. But I feel like the Player of Games is a very straightforward introduction to the Culture and then what the Culture is not, right? So as a world building book, I think it's quite successful. And I think it's worthwhile reading the Player of Games before you read Accession because you're going to have that background of what's going on here. And at the same time, it's a better book than Consider Flevis, right? The first book. So it gets the world building right. It's a pretty straightforward read, and it's a good introduction. So that sort of addresses why pick the Player of Games first, right? But as to why talk about the Culture, why talk about this series of books, I think it's important because these books have been weirdly popular with Silicon Valley libertarians, right? When we talked about the Californian ideology, or when we were talking about All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, there was that talk about how Ayn Rand was so popular, right? Ayn Rand was so popular with these people. And it's well, that's not really any surprise at all, right? That's not unusual. It's all about individualism and the creative spirit and being better than other people. But the Culture is really not so simple, right? There is a kind of fetishism of technology in these books, for sure, right? And you can see where the overlap is. But there's also a ton of social critique in these books. And these books are very much, as Fraser said, responding to pre-existing sci-fi and critiquing pre-existing sci-fi and also critiquing a lot of society that Banks was seeing around him. There is, in one of the later books, there's a scenario where basically the Culture goes to Earth and they see Thatcherite England, and then they're just these people aren't worth saving, and then they just peace out,
Oh boy.
It is Banks is an author who really is driven a lot, I think, by spite and anger, and that comes through very strongly in his writing. However, for, sort of the tech libertarian elite, somehow that, boiling rage just never registers, right? All you see is, hey, cool robot, right? Hey, hedonism. Hey, drug use. Hey, lots of sex, right? All of those sort of, I guess within the context of the Culture, they are utopian. Within the context of our reality, or what Silicon Valley actually represents, they're definitely not utopian. But But these are like appealingly sort of like hedonistic things, self-indulgent things that seem to like play off of that like Californian ideology in a really strange way, because these books are very critical, and I wanted to kind of explore that like utter failure to either read the text properly or for the text to convey what it was trying to say properly, because it's such a disconnect that I just felt it was worth bringing up.
Yeah. I mean, do you think maybe it's because, I mean, the thing that brought us onto this is that, like, I mean, Elon Musk thinks that these are influential books on him, and I can't figure out how. Like, 'cause how could he possibly miss this stuff? Right?
Well, you can see it, right? There's this kind of like frivolous playfulness and hedonism that the culture engages in that's related to technology, that you can say like, oh yeah, that's a point of connection between these two. But then you look at all of the context and what those things are supposed to actually mean and represent, and he just completely misses the point.
It's like the people who watched Star Trek and wanted to make the shit but didn't get what it was about.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, right?
How do people keep missing this? It's ridiculous.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're totally right. It is very much of a piece. It's very much of a piece with like the libertarians who love Star Trek. But I would say that the Culture series is so much more upfront about its politics than Star Trek is, right? And it's far more radical than Star Trek, because, Star Trek is definitely like has a progressive vision and stuff, but it's very like it represents a very hierarchical society in Starfleet, right? That's the main focus of the show. But this like the Culture is like some kind of Deleuzian fantasy, like it is really trying to just like think this idea of a society without a state.
It's right? A disorganized society and is very rhizomatic. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's a Deleuzian fantasy. It's
yeah. And what, like, I don't think it is, like, I would say it's neither the case that it's not more or less successful than The Dispossessed in trying to think through that sort of idea. It's thinking at a very different angle than The Dispossessed is, but they're aiming at similar problems of imagination, right? Of like trying to think through what does anarchy look like, right? And in the case of Le Guin, it's a situation of relative poverty. In the case of the Culture, it's a situation of enormous abundance. Mm-hmm.
So, like, from that, yes, I mean, I'm kind of aware that we've been rabbiting about the Culture a little bit, but for the listeners who are maybe not so aware of what this series is really about, maybe, Fraser, could you give the listeners a bit of a rundown of the general background of the Culture?
Sure. So, the Culture is run by these minds. Sometimes they're war minds, sometimes they're other minds. They're extremely advanced technology that is beyond the scope of mankind. It's like they've been given birth to and then evolved into something that nobody can understand. And now they kind of govern and watch over these groups of humanoids, these humans that are bioengineered people and kind of like represent what is being researched in the time that the book came out. So like cloning was a huge thing, and biochemical processes and stuff like that, those are central to it. But on a larger scale, I think it is trying to present a utopic society that is like a reaction to Star Trek. Right, like what if those people are on the ship, but they didn't need to drive or anything, right?
It's very much a post-scarcity, like a very, very post-scarcity society. Like it is this Culture is possessed of truly colossal wealth. Like they seem to be able to manipulate matter at a fundamental level, infinite energy sources, and all this kind of stuff. So it is a very, very utopian sort of vision.
And the scale is like far better than Star Trek, I think. At least explained far better than Star Trek.
Yeah.
Right? Like when Star Trek is like, hey, the Federation, you don't really get a sense of what the Federation is, whereas this book instead is like, yo, there's shit everywhere. Like some people in the culture could leave today and try to get to the other end of like culture space, and they'd be like dead if they weren't elongated for lifespans and stuff.
It's a galaxy spanning civilization.
Yeah, and it's also importantly a civilization that is entirely spacefaring. Like they have no connection to territory. Territory is irrelevant to them, right? Like it's like if somebody moves in, they're just going to move away, right? Or they're going to envelop them, or like that, like mobility and sort of disorganization, as you said, is core to who they are. Like they're not interested in possessing things, and that includes possessing space. So they have a very different attitude towards space than, say, Starfleet does or the Federation does, right? Like where the Federation is very much like, oh, we have our borders, you have your borders, like we're going to police them, we're going to have demilitarized zones, all that kind of stuff. Like the culture is like, no, like we're not even operating on that level anymore.
It's fun. It's a really, really cool setting.
It's like it has its problems, but it is a very evocative vision of utopia that is like very sort of liberated in a way that many are not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it elicits interesting questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. Well, I guess to get started on the actual text, it's divided into 4 chapters. I mean, it's bafflingly like there are chapters there, but they're not actually numbered. I guess these are like 4 parts. The first of which is part 1, culture plate, and we get this opening bit that's like seems to be written from a narrator's perspective, or not a narrator, but just like a sort of interjector, a voice that starts off each section.
Like ostensibly they're the narrator, but like they don't really write in a personal voice for most of the text.
Yeah,
it's just like kind of framed that they are writing this.
Yeah, and to quote it goes, "This is the story of a man who went far away for a long time just to play a game. The man is a game player called Gurga. The story starts with a battle that is not a battle and ends with a game that is not a game." So yeah, a little evocative bit to start off with, but our protagonist is this guy, Jernau Gurga, who will just be referring to as Gurga throughout the whole thing. What a fucking awful name! Like it's just so hard to pronounce properly.
It's kind of endearing how awful the names of the culture are.
These are
like,
rough, yeah.
Like they do feel sufficiently alien.
And tongue-in-cheek, I think, too, right? Yeah. Like, throughout it, people are constantly mispronouncing his name. So.
Yeah, actually, that's true. But he's the titular player of games, and in this sense, like, board games. Like, because the culture is a post-scarcity society, a lot of people just spend a lot of time dicking around playing board games. Gurga happens to be amongst the best, or probably the best that the culture actually has. So he's quite famous, he's well regarded. He's also kind of a bit of an asshole, as we get in these opening chapters of setting the stage. He's not the most sympathetic character in the world, you know.
Yeah, totally. And like it's interesting because I think like the book starts where they're basically playing like a Call of Duty style like shooter game. But like way before Call of Duty existed, right? This is like decades and decades and decades before that. But yeah, it's funny because it's like they introduce him as the player of games, but the first thing he does in the book is really, really suck at playing a game. Right?
It's because it's a physical game. It's a sort of a stand up and walk around game, but he's much more of a board game kind of guy.
Yeah, he is very much like this kind of grognardy, like 3 moves ahead style board game, very serious, intellectual, Gedankenspiel kind of player of games, right? Like he plays very specific types of games, which are these like very abstract, very cerebral games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like one of the sort of things to understand about him as well is that like he's kind of set up as being kind of bored with both life and games, like because he lives his life through games, but he's just sort of generally dissatisfied with life in the culture. I think one of the ways he puts it is that it's all a bit too easy because there's no real risk, because there's no property. There's just nothing to lose, right? Like the stakes are always simply intellectual, or the stakes are about reputation. Like he keeps winning all of his matches and his little challenge games at parties and such, but like, what would happen to him if he lost? Well, he would just lose, right? Like there's nothing to it, right? Like he has a bit of a thirst for gambling.
That's exactly it, right? He is described as a gambler,
but he has no capacity to do that here.
Yeah, in the culture, gambling is a meaningless concept. Like you can do it, but you don't really lose anything by doing it, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, and like he has this like he lives on this orbital world, like it's a ring world, like from Halo or whatever. Well, I mean the thing from Halo is ripped off from this, but like he lives in this chateau in the middle of the fucking like Alps, essentially, like on this wonderful what essentially seems to be a continent all to himself. If he lost his house, he would just move to the next continent over, you know, and just like
or build a new one, right?
Any of those options,
or the house would like get up and walk away, change into a new thing.
So that gives you a little bit of framing for that kind of stuff. But the sort of one of his buddies, who's a drone called Chambliss, suggests that if he wants a bit of adventure, he should get in touch with this organization in quotes called Contact, which is the section of the culture that, I mean, it really isn't an organization. It's not a bureaucracy of any kind. It's just the sort of group of individuals and minds in the culture that are concerned with managing contact with other species, and especially contact with newly discovered civilizations,
who are described like specifically as barbarians, right? Yeah. Like that says a lot about the culture, right? That they use that term. Like they're very smug. The culture is extremely smug. Like they're like yeah, we're not the most powerful culture around, like the most powerful civilization around, but like
we're the best.
we're still kind of the best. Like we're just cooler than everybody else. We have all, like, we don't have the best technology, but we got some pretty cool stuff, and we have a lot of fun. And the rest of you out there are just, I don't know, you got your priorities wrong.
Yeah, basic.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And it's very like amorphous what the culture is, right? Like the culture is capable of absorbing other groups into it, and it doesn't have like a rigid hierarchy. So it's more like, I don't know, kind of like an expanding franchise or something, right? Like becoming a part of the culture. So they're very self-confident, very self-assured, very smug, and look down on other people.
That notion of a franchise is something I want to get back to much later, closer to the end of the book. But anyway, yes. Yeah, so I guess the action actually picks up with this a challenge match against a sort of young upstart, this kind of young student of games who's called Alls Hap, and only really appears on screen twice. But during the match at this party again in this wonderful sort of town in the middle of the Alps on this incredible ring world, Gurga sees the opportunity for a very particular kind of technical victory in this game. It was what he called a full web victory. But they can't quite get there. He's feeling that there's a 50-50 chance he might actually win it. But during a break, he's approached by this drone called Mawhrin-Skel, who's a bit of an asshole as well. Mawhrin-Skel is a semi-decommissioned Special Circumstances drone, where Special Circumstances is a subdivision of Contact. Basically the sort of Men in Black, I suppose, of the culture.
They're basically the CIA.
Yeah, right. They're exactly the CIA of the culture. The thing is that like Mawhrin-Skel was created as for this particular purpose. However, his personality came out a bit screwy, so he was essentially defanged, where all the weapon systems in his casing were turned off and so on. Well, he was given the option of either re-roll his personality or have all his shit turned off and be turned loose in this society. He chose the latter, but so he's this really kind of horrible little creature that like just pesters everyone. But the thing is, like, he still has some of the equipment and is able to. He's able to cheat, essentially, at this game. He can X-ray the board for Gurga and give him the answer. And Gurga is wanting to find out... The temptation here is that he can find out if this full web victory is actually possible. He takes the deal. It turns out that it's not possible, so he's like,
yeah.
But he still wins, but I mean, not by much, and it wasn't the incredible, flourishing victory that it was supposed to be.
Yeah, unsatisfying.
Yeah, not great at all.
Yeah, it's totally bitter after the fact. But I think it's worth camping out on Mawhrin a little bit here.
Yeah.
Because Gurga's decision to keep Mawhrin-Skel around says a lot about Gurga.
Oh, yeah, right? Yeah. They're peas in a pod. Yeah.
Yeah, like, Mawhrin-Skel is, like, just, very bitter, very angry, always sort of, like, playing pranks, like, and like very moody, like often like storms off when he's been.
I found him to be like super sympathetic though for me, because everybody has a manufactured purpose in this world, and he was essentially doing his purpose. The way he sees it anyway, right? Like people were like, you went a little bit off the bleeding path there, and then we had to do something about it. But for him, he was like, I was made this way, I was doing what I was doing, and then they like neutered me, basically, right?
Yes, and the thing is though that like that isn't why he's appealing to Gurga at all.
No. There's another thing going on here. Yeah.
Like, as the reader, we can sympathize with Mawhrin because of that. But the thing is that Gurga completely fails to connect with Mawhrin on that level, right? Like, he doesn't care. He just likes him because he just likes having him around because he's disruptive and makes things interesting. And that's already kind of his first gamble, right? Is just choosing to be friends with Mawhrin-Skel.
Yeah, and it backfires badly on him because Mawhrin tries to blackmail him. Well, does successfully blackmail him, essentially, with the recorded conversation. And the thing he wants is that Mawhrin-Skel wants back into contact, and he wants Gurga to put in a good word for him. He happens to know that he has been in contact with Contact, and Contact have offered Gurga the possibility of going away to play a game. Which is all left very vague at this moment. But so he's now implored to actually follow through on that and to make a condition of his participation in this adventure be that Mawhrin-Skel be restored to Contact. And there's this it's at this point that Mawhrin-Skel explains this whole thing about like his resentment at this like essentially castration of being defanged. And there's a certain sense in which these are, to a lesser extent, Gurga is also hobbled by the society he's in. Like he has this desire for danger and adventure that is impossible to satisfy in this society, and Mawhrin-Skel has this other, also a sort of weird bloodthirst and a desire to like have his weapon systems reactivated that is also in. I think there's kind of a nice quote here where it's like that he's been turned loose in a paradise made for others. And that, like, he would rather not live that way. He would rather actually get back to a active duty sort of position.
Yeah. His purpose.
Yeah, exactly, right. There's a sort of a will to power here, like that he wants to actually live the authentic sort of life that he wants to. Now, you can see why, from reading it, you can see why they wouldn't allow him to do that, because he's a fucking maniac, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like to give this guy weapons, right? Like,
yeah, like it's basically like he went into combat and then he failed the psych eval, and then and they were like sorry, basically. But it does feel kind of like he's like a vet or something like that, but it's not very fleshed out sufficiently. It's like a bud of an idea and then clipped.
Yeah, and like these kinds of characters are characters that show up a lot in these books. Like these kind of discontents, misfits, malcontents, people who don't really fit into the culture very well. And oftentimes they do have that sort of like will to power thing about them. And it's usually the case that Banks is trying to subvert that. And I think it probably has like that. I don't know. It feels like in a way it's very much like this is a lot earlier, but it feels like it kind of plays off of those like 90s anti-hero characters you find in like comic books and stuff, who are like the discontents, the malcontents, like I don't fit in amongst the sheep kind of thing, right? Like
and it's cyberpunk, right?
yeah. But like Banks is never on board with that, right? Like Banks is always like nah, like
Yeah. Well, even like you get the notion that his idea of life in the culture is like the opposite of the Fight Club quote, right? Like on a long enough timeline, everybody gets what they want and then they die. There's no unhappy ending in this one. It's basically just like you do whatever you want and eventually you've kind of like done everything and you're ready to go.
Yeah. I kind of I get the impression that for the vast majority of humans or sort of organic beings in the culture, life is a pretty easy kind of hedonic kind of experience where they sort of mill about.
They just sort of
they eat, they take some
hang
nice
out,
drugs,
get high.
Yeah.
But there's going to be this like fraction of a percent of weirdos and adventurists and such, and that's what Contact and especially Special Circumstances are made up of. It's not that they're existing bureaucracies or institutions. I mean, I guess they're an institution in a sense, but not in the formal sense. I think this is just what happens when you have a segment of the population that you're always going to have who are just a bit strange and a bit kind of hungry for adventure. They gravitate towards each other and form these little cabals that, you know, go on big adventures. That's what Contact is.
Yeah, and I think Contact is really representing like a similar thing to what we saw in The Dispossessed, where you have like an organization who is charged with dealing with the outside world, and there's always the possibility that they might become a state and actually assume like a hierarchical control over this anarchy. But it's not like they're not quite in that area, right? They're a little bit more disorganized than that.
Yeah, I think it reads that way to us because we are intimately familiar with, you know, states and institutions and bureaucracies and self-perpetuating power. When reading the culture stuff, you have to keep reminding yourself that it's not that. It is this weird rhizomatic distributed centerless kind of society where the meaning of what it is to be an institution is just sort of different in a strange way that's hard to put your finger on, you know?
Yeah, but I think that nevertheless, like the idea of Contact is still grappling with those problems.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Like we're going to see this later in the book, I think, when it comes to the questions of how Gurga deals with the game he has to play. And like what contact with another culture does to him.
Exactly, yeah. I think Contact is like these weirder ones because by virtue of having contact with other people, they are not like other culture people, and they'll never be, right?
And like the culture is extremely self-satisfied. So like if you're not a weirdo, you're probably not that interested in contact with other cultures.
Right. And I thought that was the insinuation of it kind of felt like games in general was not a thing in this society. Like it was introduced after, and that's the thing that's sort of an external force that has formed Gurga into not being like everybody else, and why he has to go and leave and do all these different things and stuff, right? Like it's a virus that's like infected him with like this possibility of feeling something new through risk that nobody else knows about or can even appreciate like him.
Yeah. Right? Okay. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like play play is definitely a characteristic of the culture. Like, it is a very playful society. But the sorts of, like, very thinky, strategic games these competitive games, like, and it even says, like, in the text at some point that, like, the culture is disdainful of fame, right? And it's like, it kind of, like, crops up around these competitive games, because, like, you can prove your worth, you become famous, all that kind of thing. But, like, it's very different from something like Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, right? Where, like, everybody is obsessed with fame. Like, the culture isn't like that. And a lot of these games, it does say, are certainly, like, taken from other cultures. Like, they've been maybe, like, found by contact and brought into the culture. It doesn't really say very much about games that are developed within the culture itself.
Yeah, that's why I always felt like it was a foreign concept, and like this omnipresence was like, I could imagine just from my own projection of what I wanted from the text probably, but I could imagine this omnipresence being like, oh, like the way that Gurga was created is perfect for being one of us if we introduce a game to him, and then later we can do all this other shit, and the result is this, right? But it's definitely dependent on the reading of what you want. The reading of the book, which is dependent on what you want from the text.
Yeah,
but,
sure. Yeah.
Gurga takes the deal with contact and is briefed by a drone, a contact drone that comes to talk to him in his house, and introduce him to what the whole point of this is. It's a rather interesting game that they found that they think he might be interested in. And so he's shown this map of, like, the Empire of Azad, which is in a cloud just outside the main galaxy. And the trick is that it's both an empire and a game, in that there is a game called Azad that is woven into the fabric of this society. And the winner of the game becomes the emperor. Pretty weird, you know?
Pretty cool, though. I was super into that. I was like, ooh, this is neato.
Yeah, it is a very good conceit.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that the drone points out is that in the language of these people, Azad simply means machine or system, or organism, or, you know, a lot of these various concepts are tied up in this sort of thing. So right from the start, we're getting this kind of impression of Azad as an empire and a game and a self-replicating system and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, it feels very influenced by Deleuze.
Yeah, it did. It really did. Yeah, I mean, because I'm reading a lot of Deleuze on the side. It just like it was hard to miss the implications.
I'm not, and it's still obvious. Yeah, you're riffing off of that. Yeah.
But the other quirk of this empire is that they have three sexes, so male, female, and then a middle sex, which is the dominant one, which I think they're referred to as apex or apices.
Yeah.
It's as I mentioned at the start, it is a profoundly unwoke society. It has this, a sexual hierarchy that's worse than our own by quite a long stretch, you know. There's an extra layer to it. But in general, this is a scathing, horrible, spiteful critique of, not horrible because it's actually correct, a critique of our own society. This is a hyper-capitalist empire, violent, hierarchical, based essentially on domination and competition.
It's also, like, genocidal.
All the same phobias, like homosexuality, like everything that is like alt-right is just, they're like, that's that good shit.
Yeah, it's the alt-right stuff on intramuscular steroids, which is ironic.
They're even gamers, so
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Although this one wide open.
Yeah, and that's even maybe some more context too. Is everybody in the culture can change their sex whenever they feel like as well. Yeah. So it's even more of a foreign culture for Gurga, who's just like, oh, y'all don't just change.
Yeah. So the culture has, as you said, like the ability to change sex at will. They have implanted drug glands that emit psychoactive drugs at will. Azad doesn't have any of those things. It's in general, a more primitive society, but still, like, it's spacefaring and so on.
They kind of have used biotechnology to engineer like this horrible uniformity.
It's eugenics
amongst them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's more eugenics and genocide than it is any kind of sophisticated biotechnology.
Certainly. And what I found fun was the initial reveal of the game boards, because the game of Azad is played on multiple large boards the size of tennis courts, and also many sub games like card games off to the side. It's a seriously complex and dynamic game, which is sort of like, the way the drone explains it is that it sort of mirrors the life of the Empire of Azad. That, like, being the kind of reason it's used as a way to select the emperor, or to select various stations in the bureaucracy, is because, like, expertise at Azad is expertise at life in that empire. It's all mirrored, right?
Well, and expertise in so far as being able to manipulate the outcome that you want.
Yeah, and it's very much a situation of the map is the territory, right? Like, they're just one-to-one.
The only thing you're really understanding is the function of the various pieces insofar as the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
But that's it.
So there's an interesting bit here then of, like, well, why, because information is generally open in the culture, like, why hasn't Gurga heard of this before? Contact are keeping it secret, which, again, is a bit of a conspiratorial sort of thing. The reason, though, is that if this was widely known, the public outcry in the culture to this barbaric society would be so loud that they would essentially be forced to go in as an occupying force to, like, forcibly assimilate them, which is contrary to the morals of the culture. Like, that's not a role they ever relish. Like, that's not something they ever want to do.
That is the important point here, is that they're like, we would be forced to do that, and that would be a very bad idea.
Extremely.
Right? Like, that's not going to lead to anything good for us or for them, right? And like, so contrast that to, like, liberal humanitarianism and internationalism, right? Like, where it's like, oh, these people are so barbarous, obviously we need to invade the country to make them better, right? Like, it's very much like anti-interventionist. Even though special circumstances are always involved with these foreign societies, and they definitely do not follow the prime directive. They're very cautious. They're very, very cautious. They've sat on this for like 70 years, right?
70 years, yeah. They also say that, like, that caution was learned over time, that, like, they were more cavalier before, and now they're a lot more cautious with this stuff later on. But the offer here is that they want Gurga to go and participate in the game, which I think is held every couple of years. It's like a big tournament sort of thing, and is part of the cycle of that society, to participate and to just see if he can learn it. See if it's possible for their best player to participate and maybe even win, I don't know, a low-level clerical position or something, just to kind of prove it out. Crucially, they've been lying to the Empire as well. The Empire is not aware of the extent of the culture. They don't know that they're a galaxy-spanning society. They think they're just another relatively small but, like, slightly more advanced society that is local to their little cloud. They don't know about the gene fixing. They don't know about the ability to change sex at will, and a couple of other little things. So there's games being played here, right?
So many games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Is a big psyop. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like they build it as kind of like an intelligence gathering mission for both. Like, they know that the Empire is going to learn some shit because Gurga's going to be there, and that'll just telegraph certain things about the culture anyway. And then also, hey, like, while you're here, you can play your game, and our little drone's going to learn some shit.
Yeah, and it speaks to the sort of extravagance of the culture that Gurga is like, yeah, this makes sense, this pans out, right? Like, this
Well,
tracks,
he's kind
like,
of naive, right? Like, he's not the brightest guy.
well, yeah, but also, like, I think it does speak to just how rich the culture is that they can send somebody to another galaxy to play a game to see if they could do it, right?
And it's a 5-year journey, right? Like, there and back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he has to take a big ship, and it's yeah, exactly. It is not a cheap operation at all. He's not staying at a Holiday Inn, you know, like it's not like he's getting the bus there. But anyway, he takes up the offer and heads off. We get into part 2, Imperium, where the narrator, quote, narrator, interjects again with a little note about pronouns, which I thought was quite interesting. That for this empire, again with their 3 sexes, male will be referred to as male, female to female, and then in whatever language this is being translated into, you know, wink, we will use the pronoun appropriate to the dominant sex in that language's main society. So the middle sex in this society is referred to as he, him. So there are 2 sets of he, hims and 1, you know, she, her. In the way this is all sort of laid out.
Yeah. Another kind of thing that was like gesturing at progressiveness, but like didn't quite, you know, do the hop skip and then
it doesn't
failed at the jump kind of thing.
Doesn't
right?
quite stick the landing, but it's a passable attempt. Yeah, certainly.
Definitely, yeah. The intent in both books, I would say, is quite good. This one much better and less ham-fisted, but still, I mean, it was published in '88 though, so I mean, props.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I feel like it is. Yeah, it's definitely not where like gender studies is now. That's for sure. But like at a time when political correctness was under such heavy attack, like as a concept, like the idea of engineering an entire language to model a progressive ideal of what gender is was probably pretty radical.
Yeah, and that it's reflecting the specific society, right? Like, I think it's the first taste of, like, Gurga has to learn the language, and he's kind of like, whoa, this is wild stuff, right?
Yeah. Because obviously the culture speaks a language called Mawhrin, which is a synthetic language that was invented by the minds to allow for a certain fluidity of thought that doesn't translate well into the Empire's language. But I think that the sort of the knowing wink here is that, like, the book is ostensibly being translated from Mawhrin into English. And it's the thing of, like, we'll use whatever pronouns reflect power in your local language. So it's the trick is that what you would expect to be the neutral maybe pronouns for the middle sex is actually referred to as he, him. So I mean the journey there isn't particularly eventful. He's paired up with this drone called Fleur Imsaho. I fucking hate these names. It's so bad. And spends most of the time studying to try and get a grip on this game.
And sucks.
Oh yeah, he's fucking
At least initially.
Yeah. There's like living pieces or something. There's like these bioorganic fucking engineered pieces that are like carrots that like throb or whatever when you touch them. And he's like, he's like taking them to bed to like cuddle them to try and figure out what they do or some shit like that.
Yeah, there was some stuff where I was like, okay, so like I think to me that was just Banks signaling that the game is more technological than what we have and can perceive now. Like, it has biochemical reactions to people touching them and stuff and smells and all that kind of stuff. So it was definitely weird though when he took it to bed.
Pretty strange. It is an incredibly complex game. That's the message that's being given here, is that it is so complex. Now, I think I had initially thought before reading this that the trick that this would turn on would be that the game is so complex that it is actually in fact the market. You know what I mean? Like that. I thought that would have been a cool thing, but reflecting on it, probably very hard to actually represent in written form. But in lieu of that, we just have this like baffling set of rules that are dynamic. The pieces seem to be able to react to each other and accumulate properties in sort of bizarre ways. It's very strange, and he struggles with it, right? Like it's pretty bad.
And it's his life for like 5 years or whatever.
Yeah, just imagine.
He does nothing else. He stops like emailing or
he loses contact with his buddies and so on.
Yeah.
I think it's like 2 years to get there. Was the thing.
Yeah, something like that.
2.5, something like that. Yeah.
2 years there, 1 year on the planet, 2 years back, 5 years total, I think. Something like that.
Very rough.
Yeah.
Very rough. But yeah, like I think the game sort of, it's not really a direct analogy to the market, but it's more sort of like representing the ways in which personal decisions in a capitalist system are like structurally determined to be oppressive, right? Like it's like, it's about misogyny, it's about hierarchy, it's about like all number of different things, right? Like and like the market kind of like factors into that, but it's just sort of this general idea of a structural system of oppression that is fairly capitalist flavored. You'd have to at least say, yeah.
And just like whatchamacallit, like the reaction that you should have to it is bad because these people are treating their lives like literally a game. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, that's the theme that develops throughout the whole thing, right? That like there's this the logic of the Empire is very much mirrored in its game, right? Like, and the callousness with which people are treated in the Empire is mirrored in the callousness with which the players treat the pieces.
Yeah, and look at what has happened since '88 with our society. Like that is where we've gone, right? Like everybody treats themselves and their relationships to other people instrumentally in terms of game advancement, right? Like and yep, that's the critique.
It's right in there. Yeah.
Yep. So it begins.
The critique is mirrored as well in the interactions with the people of this empire. So like on arrival, it's sort of like the impression you get of the like flyover to the landing at the spaceport is like it's flying over Detroit or whatever. It's just this like kind of big city, but it's all kind of sort of horrible looking and industrial. There's a bit in the flyover, and it's never really brought up again. But like, there's a prison that's made up of like a maze or something, like a moral maze prison. And the thing is that you don't get a trial; you just get thrown into the middle of this maze, and escaping from the maze is a test of moral fortitude or something, which gives you that little bit of flavor for what these people are about, right?
Well, yeah, and it's a pretty nice like comment on the so-called correctional system, right?
Yeah. But I mean, the usual stuff: arrival, greeting, party. These people are like, dressed up in very fancy uniforms. They're obsessed with formalities. Just generally, kind of. They come across as very they're human. They're human essentially. Like they're very slightly sort of different in appearance, but they are human.
They're Star Trek human.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna say.
Right? But they definitely come across as repressed and very suspicious and very Oedipalized. Like I mean, the module that the module is like the little shuttle that Gurga will live in and serves as like his escape shuttle and also living quarters. It's bugged, like right from the start, and like everything, there's always a suspicion of surveillance because it's just what these folks are like,
I really liked how Fleur had to wear the outer shell to make it look stupid and stuff.
Yeah,
that was just hilarious, right? He was just like, they make me wear this carcass
because like he's a culture drone, which means he's actually made of hardened light, like he's made of fields, like what would appear visually as a sort of a ceramic is actually made of like hard light. They can't give that away to these people, right? They can't let on that they're that advanced, so he has to wear this like essentially aluminium can over himself. That just,
it feels like it's definitely a reference to Doctor Who, right?
But he's very put out.
And he has to make a humming sound too, right? Like he's bad technology and stuff
and
like
do little
that.
sparks and stuff to just make it look like he's totally fucking useless.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is a social commentary in itself, right? Like in the way that, like, you know, oppressed people have to make themselves look stupid in order to fit in, right?
Right.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah, it's
and
passing.
and not make a scene, not cause waves, not draw the ire of people who are in power.
Yeah. I mean, these folks get an eyeful of this power at like the initial reception, you know, and everyone's like very welcoming this wonderful guest from beyond the stars, you know. The reception, this enormous fucking ball, this horrendous display of wealth and so on. Gurga has an interesting observation here that it seems that these people are stuck in a prior age, because he's been studying their history, and the way they dress and the way they conduct themselves would have been at home with, you know, what he knows of their history 1,000 years prior. Which, you know, very much like our society, right? Like, obsessed with the previous century.
They're obsessed with... Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that was really good. I enjoyed that as well. They were like, instead of being progressive, they're
regressive.
Like cherishing and glorifying all the old stuff. Yeah, just like when you go to the palace.
They are like, the idea of being conservative is like bizarre and hard for him to parse, right? Like that is like, well, why would you do that, right? Because the culture is just constantly changing.
And the culture relishes having like a variety of architectural styles and a variety of art styles and fashion that changes every year, and that's a mark of pride, right? Like getting stuck like this in a nostalgia trap, which just seems very strange to him.
And it is an effective trope that like Banks employs of like the stranger in a strange land. Right, like that none of the world around us, like that we experience under capitalism, like makes any sense to this character at first.
Baffling, yeah. We do get to meet a character that's sort of managed to bridge his way into this culture a little bit. This guy called Za, who's essentially the culture ambassador to this empire. Bit of an asshole again, but seems to be like really getting kind of absorbed into this stuff. Like, He describes the Empire as vicious but sexy. You know, he's like very taken with it. Which is... how does Gurga react to this initially? Like, he seems kind of put off, but is also, like, it's kind of undeniable that the Empire, as described to him, did seem vicious but sexy, you know? And that's kind of partially why he's here. Well, he's also been pushed into it by that fucking dickhead drone, but, like... We're starting to get the initial scene of like seeing Gurga slip towards assimilation into this society.
Yeah, and Za is like, hello, my name is consumer culture. I have been appropriated by the system.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, like it's showing how like the structural systems of oppression are capable of just like digesting people and making them conform, right? Yeah. Bad shit.
So we're on to the first actual game, which is you know, it's a tournament setup, right? Like the whole city, not even just the whole city, but the whole empire is up for this like Olympic Games sort of thing, like this big grand tournament. But his first game is against 9 other players, so it's 10 in total playing on these boards. What's crucial here is that he's doing pretty badly initially, but then he starts to do well when he can see what's happening on the board and can lie or bluff in the language of the game. So there's this theme of assimilation. Like once he can figure out how to think in terms of the game and its language and the language of Azad, he actually thrashes them. Then he just like fucking obliterates them
without critical thought, though. Yeah, involved. Yeah.
It's like, I can do a neat thing. It's basically the same as what happened when he was playing the game back in the culture. Like, I forget what the name of that game was, but the one where he cheated, right?
Or something, yeah.
Yeah, Stricken, yeah. Yeah, when he was playing Stricken, like, and he had that moment of, like, resolving all of the structure into something comprehensible. He's just approaching it the same way and not thinking critically about what that actually implies.
Yeah, with the callback of him thinking that it's quite close to the other barbaric game Damage, right, from the first one.
yeah, right, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's there isn't much of the play described. Like you get this the way the games are actually played is always described from like Gerga's thought process of like what he's experiencing and what he's feeling as he's like, oh gosh, I can't really see what they're up to. Now it makes sense. It's all slotting together. You know, this abstract model that he's manipulating in his head. Which I suppose saves the author from having to cook up an actual set of rules, right? Like, you can just sort of leave it to the imagination.
Personally, I was like, thank fuck, right? I was like, I don't want to learn this game. Otherwise, right now on eBay, there'd be people being like, oh yeah, it's the 1988 board game licensed from whatever, right? You'd just be like, fuck that.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, just the description of it being played on like 3 boards and stuff, it just kind of reminded me of like Gloomhaven or Twilight Struggle or something like that, like one of these gigantic board games. And yeah, I'm sure someone would have the ambition to construct Azad, but thankfully Banks didn't do the standard science fiction thing of detailing all the rules and stuff.
I guarantee you would have got published and popular. Some game company hit them up and be like, want to make Azad? And he's like, you didn't read the book.
Yeah. The next scene is actually quite interesting, where he's taken out for a night on the town with Za to this like just shitty nightclub called the Hole, just like fucking bizarre, like an underground club. This is kind of rough, right? Like you have these like public displays of bizarre violence and kind of entertainment. You have like bruise art, where people are strutting around with fucking bruises on them, like made into look like people, like to look like portraits. Yeah, really, really dark sort of stuff. And what's interesting is to like contrast this dark kind of recreation with the dorky board game parties that we were seeing before in the culture, right? Like
just like lighting little lanterns and like go fly down the cliff face, right? Like,
yeah, it was like something out of Harvest Moon or something. It's just so innocent.
Yeah, it's very idyllic and like just sort of goofy, and then you get here and it's like, ugh.
It's distinctly not idyllic at all.
It is very like the streets have its own way for dealing with things, right? Like it was very like there's neon everywhere and there's 4 different subcultures in here, and it's all really bad and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean it's your very much sort of your generic sort of cyberpunk nightclub scene. Except for, like, Gerga gets roped into this kind of caper involving 2 ladies and a shitty boyfriend or whatever. There's a chase, a gun, escape, run, that kind of shit. But he and the 2 end up in, like, what is just, I suppose, the champagne room or whatever, sort of a back room with a bed and a bunch of mirrors, and start getting intimate. But then Za bursts in, smashes open one of the mirrors and finds a camera. Recording the stuff, and this is like clearly to get incriminating evidence against Gerga, right? Like, because he has been warned, don't touch the ladies. Just you will be fucking executed if you engage in any of this kind of stuff.
And it also is in parallel with Western culture's views about sex and being prudes and stuff like that, right? Like, if we can show the savage having sex, then nobody will care how well he does in the game because it's just a scandal.
Yeah, and it was definitely set up in the earlier part of the book as well that, like, you know, Gerga is as like most people in the culture are like polyamorous, and this is another thing where it's like it just doesn't really make sense to him that like having like massive scandals about violating monogamy norms.
So I mean, somebody's after him, right? This is the thing, like he's being set up. And this is a theme that recurs, like that he has been accepted here as a guest to play the game, but the the system, the administration, the bureaucracy has this allergic reaction at various levels and kind of wants rid of him. I mean, they grab the tape and they run, basically. And they get on with the game, and he flattens the people, in that game, and goes on to the second round. And again, remember that thing we mentioned before of like this like distinct tick-tock kind of cadence here, where in each of these chapters, exactly two things happens. And one of them is to do with the game that's being played, and the other is to do with some kind of sideshow, or like something to do with like filling out the background of the Empire. It's a reassuring predictability to the structure of the chapters.
And interestingly, too, I found that as soon as he gets good, essentially, right, for Gamer Talk, he doesn't think about the game anymore, right? Like, there's no paragraphs dedicated to like, I gotta think this person and stuff. It's just like, and I win.
Yeah, that's like, yeah, definitely. Because like, I mean, there's a thing here, like there's one chapter where the main feature is this like assassination attempt, but like the opening is a paragraph of like, oh yeah, he steamrolls the guy in the game or whatever. The tabloids are after him. He's a danger to the Empire. It's a very much like a Daily Mail kind of thing. Like they're rhyming off the headlines. He's this foreigner that's come here to destroy our society or whatever. But yeah, coming out of after flattening this poor guy, he comes out of the game hall and gets jumped like an assassination attempt. Which is another thing. Like they're definitely trying to get rid of him. Za thinks this is a CIA thing. The secret police are after him, but they probably won't do it again. This is kind of where we get a bit more of the whole thing of like the tension here of like allowing this guest, and yet like he is a mortal danger to the society because the society is already brimming with like the potential for revolution, right? Like almost nobody likes living in the society. They have to appease the culture, or like they have to allow this formality of allowing the guy to participate and also try and get rid of him at the same time. Yeah,
like the spectacle is the most important thing to keep people in check. It's like the gladiatorial games and stuff, right? Like, shit's going bad down here, let's have some games.
Keeping... It's like observing the procedures and norms of Azad, the game, is all important in the similar way to like religious ritual, right? Like it says that like Azad basically was created like coextensively with the religion of the culture, right? Like these are like just like things that completely fit together. And if they broke their own rules like publicly about what is and is not allowed in the game, kind of similar. Like I think the way that I kind of thought about Azad in a way is like that it's similar to sort of like the discourse about like equality of opportunity, right? Like that like, oh yeah, like we don't have equality of outcome, but we do have equality of opportunity, right? Like, so like, oh, everybody's got a shot, right? Like, oh, you can participate in Azad, all you have to do is wager your body. That means we're like progressive, right? Like, because it's not just about your assets, it's about your grit and determination.
It's the American dream, I think.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And I mean, like, yeah, you can come here and participate, and you can win a couple of games, but you'll get gunned down by tier 1 operators outside the fucking hall, right? Like, and that's he survives it though, right? Like that's the thing, and comes away from it.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of similar to the way the education system works in our society, right? Where it's this gauntlet you have to go through to get like certified as like you are a valid person, right? Like and so it because they're like willing to accept like a foreigner into their game, it shows like it legitimizes the people at the top, right? Because they're like, oh well, anybody can participate in Azad, and the people who are just the best are the ones at the top.
Yeah, you can have confidence in the Empire because he has ruled over somebody else's culture as well. We're truly the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a sense here that like Gurga is actually starting to kind of believe this stuff, like, or well, he's getting sucked in, right? That like, and even like the way he sort of thinks about like he's actually starting to feel alive now. You know, he's getting that real risk and the fear and the thrill of the gamble. And there's a sense that he's starting to actually kind of see this as a beautiful sort of society, again with its shittiness, but you know, there's that kind of like, what was it, vicious but sexy sort of line that he got at Azad. He's starting to really fall for that.
And he's like, after the nightclub, he couldn't help but absorb some of their culture, and so wins easily more. And instead of thinking now, he is feeling instead. Yeah.
And like as you said, like the descriptions of the gameplay become shorter and shorter, right? Because he's just starting to steamroll these people, right? Like he's bringing this like a hyper intelligence for gaming, and then merging it with an actual appreciation for the society that plays this game, and then just flattening these poor fuckers. Yeah.
Yeah. He plays to get the rush.
Yeah. He's there's a bit here of like being aware that like there's a possibility that in the next round they'll pull the physical option on him, which is something we forgot to mention back in the briefing part, but that one of the ways the Azad Empire tries to level the playing field, in quotes, is that they can allow for wagers of the body in the game, which is essentially, you put your genitals on the line as a forfeit, or some other sort of physical forfeit as a way of being like, hey, like as you said, Kyle, like that. Hey, look, it's not all about your position in society. Anyone can have a go. Ooh, boy.
Yeah, as long as you got grit and determination and the willingness to wager being raped, it is
or neutered, or like I think it's even alluded to that it's like days of torture and stuff too. Like it could be like anything the opponent names.
But Gurga is starting to suspect they might pull this on him, and starts laying emergency exit plans with the ship. He gets a little sort of teleport beacon embedded in his tongue, a little pill that he swallows. And this is a thing that, like, obviously the ship isn't allowed near the sort of home world, but it's at a holding pattern way out in the outer solar system. You know, at his signal, it'll zoom in and, like, as it passes, teleport him off the planet. If he does the right thing. So starting to get a bit of a sense of like trying to like, you know, there's a sense that the net is closing, right? Like there's a lot of actual physical threats against his life, and he might need to literally zap out of there at a moment's notice. And this actually happens in the next game, where I think it's that like initially there's like very limited sort of play. It's not very energetic, and then the guy just goes, "Oh, I must ask for a wager of the body," you know, and the must stands out, right? Like, it's like, oh, somebody's telling him to do this. It's interesting here that, like, this wager is interesting because for Gurga, it would be painful, but not catastrophic, because they can regrow stuff in the culture. That's not the case in Azad. If this guy loses his genitals, he loses his position in that society entirely, and the likely outcome is suicide. Because that would just be the end of his career, the end of everything.
And he was like a minister, like a predominant member of society in some way. I can't remember the exact specifics, but he's a bigger deal, you know.
Yeah, and it's just getting to this being like an intensely misogynistic culture.
Oh, it's horrible. This is a disgusting society. Like it's
it's literally, do you have the balls for this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like when gamers always ask each other and shit, right? Like, oh, it's like put up or shut up culture, and
definitely. And to kind of like to follow on from that, then the next sort of chapter, then he's take like it's these breaks between games. Like these games last for multiple days, so like in the evening he's just kind of hanging around in the shuttle. He's taken out on a stroll by Fleur Saho, the drone. I'm just going to call him the drone. Fuck it. He's taken out, you know, with the thing of like, oh well, we'll be leaving in a couple of days. You should really see some of the sights. And he's like, oh fine, fuck it. But they go out, but he's taken on a tour of just like seeing the poverty and destitution of the average neighborhood in this city. Nasty stuff, just like random violence on the streets. Homeless everywhere. Just everyone sort of in pretty horrible sort of condition. real fucking shithole. Because like he's seen so far just the kind of bougie elite sort of spheres. He's getting a real look at like what actually goes on here. I think it's interesting that like the author dwells on healthcare in particular. Like they go to a hospital and have a look around, and like all the time the drone is rhyming off stats about like rates of illnesses, rates of mental illnesses, what happens to the mentally ill in this society. They're destitute, they're left out in the streets. It's an unusually busy night tonight because a carrier arrived from a remote war campaign and dumped off all its veterans. And they all showed up at the hospitals. Just this absolute fucking grotesquerie.
And they're like sailors coming back from the ship, and there's like parallels there where they're trying to like hook up with prostitutes and then
getting the shit kicked out of them in the middle of the road, and just ooh boy, nasty stuff.
Yeah.
But it gets worse.
And also, and condemnation of the prison system is reiterated again as well.
Yeah. I mean, Gurga's shaken by this, but it does get worse, right? That like he's brought back to the shuttle and shown these like encrypted TV broadcasts in this society. He's been tuning into the news and looking at bullshit, but these are the encrypted channels for only the highest sort of ranking officials. And level 1 is sort of dom kink sort of stuff, and it's like, officially this would be scandalous, but actually in private, in the elite sort of tiers, it's like, oh, look at this thing we get to enjoy. Level 2 is much more hardcore sort of pornography, and then level 3 is just outright snuff, like executions and just contrived violence and just absolutely miserable, horrible sort of stuff. But yeah, this shakes them pretty fucking bad. Like real bad.
I think they tried to, what I got a sense of was the people watching 3 are enjoying the people suffering from the physical option specifically too, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
Which is like, again, like making it's just such a mockery of the idea that this is like progressive, right? That we allow the physical option, but then actually it's like commodified and used as like, snuff material. Yeah.
But like Gurga brings this back to the game, then like he just wipes out his opponent with this like hyper aggressive, pitiless kind of style, and the guy's dragged off to be neutered, basically. And like Gurga is like falling into the abyss at this point. Like he's relishing the hate that's coming out of the news agencies about him, and you get the sense that he would prefer if the culture actually just came in and nuked the whole place. So yeah, bad shit. But yeah, he's on to the next round, which is a bit of a change in scene because it's held on this what they call the Fire Planet, some sort of planet where it's like where the final rounds will take place. It's got this bizarre kind of environment where like it's all ocean except for the equator, which is all land. Like it's a strip of land all the way around the equator, and there's a like bushfire that moves from east to west all the time and like burns a front of vegetation and leaves behind it ash, and it takes a couple of years to make a cycle of the planet so that by the time it gets around again everything's regrown, and then it's pretty fun. And then there's like a 12-year cycle where these weird cinder trees grow, and like at the end of the 12 years they like have like, I don't know, like coconuts made of napalm or something where everything catches fire, like and so the point is that this society Azad is keyed to this rhythm, where this 12-year cycle is where the new emperor is decided through the games. And so where they're headed for is this fortified castle, where the last rounds will be played out, and then it'll be timed so that this giant conflagration where all the napalm trees catch fire will happen, and then afterwards the new emperor will emerge like a phoenix, essentially. So very intricate, right? Like this is these guys are not fucking around when it comes to putting together this elaborate mythology for their whole society to be structured by.
Yeah, like, it feels like the winner achieves apotheosis, essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. At this point, like, Gurga's being pressured to drop out and all this kind of stuff. Like, there's a lot of political chicanery happening here. He's resisting, like, he's saying, well, I'll keep playing. I'm not going to take the offer to just bow out. Like, people are concerned that this will actually destabilize the society. There's a sense in which, like, his cockiness in the political arena is mirrored in his proficiency in the game, right? Like, that he is, in fact, getting better at navigating, because like, he's going toe to toe with, like, not in the game sense, but in the sort of like conversational sense, he's going up against like high ranking officials of this society and holding his own in conversation and like navigating to some extent these political situations. Yeah, is there much we need to sort of say about this stay on this planet until we get to the kind of climax? I guess one of them is that he receives a video from home where his drone buddy back home has like received a package, or no, like there's been a package delivered to Gurga's house at home, and he's getting this thing where the package is the carcass of Mawhrin-Skel. Like, it's just this, it's empty shell, like, and the mind core has been hollowed out. So it's like the drone guy is like, what the fuck happened here? Like, did he die, or did he like change into a different form or something? And also, why did they send you his dead body? Like, this drone carcass just shows up on the doorstep. It's pretty weird.
Yeah. Yeah, that was weird. I thought maybe they were like trying to ease his mind a little bit, like one less thing to worry about or something, because he was pretty stressed out initially about what would happen. Like, he sensed that the drone was disturbed, and then is integrated anyway. So it was strange. Like, I was like, are they trying to make him feel better and they're just weird at it, or what is the point of that?
Yeah, I think maybe it also could be a bit of a bit of a practical joke, you know, that like, well, given what happens later in the book, right? Like, there is a certain mischievous nature to this character, right? And
right, it could
like,
just be foreshadowing.
Yeah, it may just be like, oh, what's going on over here? Yeah,
right. Yeah. I mean, like, so if Mawhrin-Skel got like transferred to another body or something, he could just pretend to be somebody else and come back and plague Gurga like a fucking ghost, like in a different form, and it's a taunting sort of gesture in a way, or at least it seems that way at the moment. So I think the next sort of major real plot point is that there's another attempt on his life at this rather horrid hunt, where out in these trees they've rounded up all these animals and they're just shooting the shit out of them essentially. It's all sort of barbaric and horrible. Gurga's kind of into it. A guy wearing a sort of exoskeleton, like the exoskeleton flips out and, you know, autonomously tries to kill Gurga, which is actually a really cool scene. The guy in the exoskeleton is trying to resist, but then like Gurga shoots him in the face, and like that makes the exoskeleton more effective because it doesn't have the guy struggling to contend with, so it can move faster, which is all very good fun.
There's actually a really good short story that Banks wrote later. Because there's a book in the series that's just a collection of short stories. It's also the one with the Thatcher thing in it, and there's a really good story in there about just a guy and his exoskeleton, and you should I would definitely recommend checking that out. I forgot what the name of the book is, but yeah, you can totally look it up. Yeah, just a really nice little short story.
Yeah. We'll see if we can figure that one out for the show notes. I'm sure it can't be that hard to get it from the wikis. But like, so this attack seems to have been orchestrated by this guy Hammond, who was the guy who was trying to convince him to drop out. Again, Hammond believed he was acting in the Emperor's best interests, which kind of I found very interesting because like the structure of the Empire is this sort of like obviously hierarchical, but there's these like recursive circles of power. It's a recursive set of interiors, and like this is a person who is maybe 5 or 6 recursions away from the Emperor, and believes that he is acting in the Emperor's best interest. Like, he thinks he's inside the inner circle, but he's not, right? Like, his interests actually differ. His perception of the Emperor's interests actually differ from their real interests. And it seems that as Gurga gets closer and closer to the actual seat of power, more and more layers of abstraction fall away, and he starts to see the much more authentic interests of this inner core of powerful beings. Contrast that with, as we were saying, the rhizomatic and distributed and web-like nature of the culture, right? Like, they could not be more different societies.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you talk to somebody in contact, well, you're just talking to the person in contact, right? There's no like inner circle of contact. There's just contact. Anybody you talk to there is that's the surface, right? Like there is no deep core.
Yeah, it's all surface, and the center is everywhere. Like it's highly distributed, and like contact is all just personal relations. Like it's a buddy network. It's not, there isn't a core to it. It's just like, oh, I know a guy, and oh yeah, I've worked with John. He's cool, that kind of shit. Yeah, like they simply could not be more different societies. But predictably, Gurga ends up in a position where he's taking on the Emperor himself, Nikosar. And it's an interesting game, right? Because Gurga, like obviously Nikosar is a really good player, and Gurga starts out struggling, and he sort of thinks there's something he's missing. There's some dimension to this he can't quite get a handle on. And in a break, he sort of chats with the drone about the drone is for some reason looking at like physics textbooks, like models of reality and stuff, and ultra space and this kind of thing. Gurga's a dumbass. He didn't really go to school or anything, like, so he doesn't really know any of this sort of stuff. But they chat over it, and it seems to give him some sort of tiny insight into what might be going on here. And he realizes that the hidden dimension to all of this is that Nikosar is playing as the Empire. Like, the way he plays, there's another layer of recursion to this, where not only does the logic of the game reflect the Empire, but he is role-playing as the Empire in the game. And Gurga realizes that his play style is implicitly role-playing as the culture, which is why his style is so alien, and like nobody can get a grip on it, because it is just completely contrary to what this other playstyle is. So you have finally this clash, explicit clash, where Gurga understands exactly which two forces are really being opposed on the table.
Yeah, and that the Emperor also realizes this, and his intention is to destroy the allegory of the culture if he can by destroying Gurga.
Their like whole worldview and like methodology and civilization is kind of on the line here, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. So like Gurga takes on a sort of style then of like, once he realizes this, he takes on a style of like playing the culture as an offensive force, like an imperial culture almost, which is interesting in that it mirrors the exact fear of the contact people, that like if they were to intervene with the Empire, they would end up in an aggressive stance and come in as an occupying force. Gurga actually has to take up that stance here in the inside the game to make any headway against the Emperor.
Yeah, and he like also has to when he realizes this, he has to make a decision about what is most important to him, and it becomes the game, right? Like, whereas earlier on, he didn't have that kind of thirst to win. Now he has like more of the qualities of the Empire and can't really stop. Like, he almost doesn't even consider it. He just is like, what's my angle to get at this win now, right? Whereas everybody else is like, yo, you should probably stop because things are going to go down. And he's like, I'm winning.
Oh, he goes off the deep end properly here.
Yeah, and this kind of echoes what happens in the first book as well, right? In Consider Phlebas, where the culture has to militarize to fight the Iridians, and like there's this talk in the beginning of this book about how like oh, a lot of these warships were like decommissioned after the War of the Iridians and stuff like that, right? So there's this kind of like back and forth tension between aggression and passivity that Contact is always wrestling with. And like that is where like Gurga is like thrown into in this match.
Yeah, he has to, it's that whole, like, old adage of, to beat the enemy, you must become the enemy, that kind of stuff, right?
Oh, very much so, yeah. It's, that's the theme that's running through all of this. There's an interesting bit here where, it's just before a break in the play, where, Gurga sort of realizes that he can't win, or he sees the outcome, but he also sees that Nikosar doesn't, like the Emperor doesn't, which means I think that like Gurga has reached a point where he is more of an expert in this game than anyone, including the current champion. That he can see the play in a way that nobody else in the room can, which is interesting because like
because he can see from both perspectives now. He can see it via the culture as well as the Empire, whereas Nikosar can only see the Empire, so he's kind of half blinded.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess then the final sort of session kicks off in this like bloody cascade of violence where basically the Emperor stages like a sort of a mad coup, essentially, with the intention of preventing Gurga from winning. It's all sort of rigged up in such a way that like obviously the line of fire and the flames in the trees is approaching. They think it's about 2 hours away, but then it's much closer because they've artificially, you know, the Imperial Guard have artificially started another fire closer to the place. So it's just this really chaotic sort of scene of like the Imperial Guard firing into the crowd and all this sort of stuff, just trying to stop this person from winning. Nikosar is eventually killed by the drone, Fleur Msaho. And, you know, our guy Gurga blacks out, and when he wakes up, the drone gives him this rundown that it was all a huge special circumstances operation all along. He's not actually, you should have seen this coming, right? He's not actually who he claims to be. He's actually a combat drone from special circumstances. And this was a ploy to collapse the Empire by discrediting the central institution of that empire.
And there is a line that the drone who is sent to him from special circumstances says just before he leaves about like, well, it sure would be nice to destroy that empire, but of course we would never do that. No. So they're always kind of like playing at like what they're actually after here, right?
Yeah. I felt like a bit of a mug at the end here. Like I sort of didn't see it coming because like I was playing along with the line that was given by those special circumstances people that like I thought there was going to be a slightly different ending, but no, it just turns out it was one huge CIA op all along. Yeah, fun.
Yeah, that seems to be Banks. But the thing that I liked about the ending a lot too was though like Gurga isn't completely over to their side because he still doesn't see Nikosar's plan coming to fruition, despite the idea that he's better at the game, and what he's doing is a move from the game, essentially, in real life. Like Gurga would never practice the actual things, like the moves of Azad in real life, whereas Nikosar does actively, and that's why he is the Emperor. And so he doesn't see the move coming in real life, even though he should have. And then, yeah.
It's telegraphed pretty obviously, right? Like, and he should see it coming a mile off, but he doesn't because, like,
But there's a great parallel there, though, right? Where Gurga also gets played because he is a player of games, but special circumstances is playing a bigger game than he can conceptualize because he's just interested in board games and stuff. But they're playing a large political game in a similar way to like Nikosar is, right?
Right, exactly. And also the idea behind like his victory when he sees it, remember? And like Nikosar's like, oh, I don't see it, but he specifically says he only has two options now, and one of them is exactly what he ends up doing, right? In real life, not in the game. So he does see what's coming, but he's still blind to it.
Gurga is certainly a naive character, right? Like he's not clued in to even at the peak of his abilities, he's still very blind to the actual operations of this society, and is blindsided by something that should have been very obvious. Because like they do entertain the possibility of just evacuating before bothering to do the last session, but then he goes, nah, I'll still do it, and then like it's just so obvious what's going to happen. Crucially as well, like throughout the story, Gurga has been kept in the dark about a couple of details about the interaction between the culture and the Empire. One of them here is that the highest ranking officials in the Empire are actually aware of the full extent of the culture. And so, but also, prior to this last session, the Emperor had been briefed that, by the drone, that Gurga was in fact the culture's champion and was here to destroy them. And everyone's being played against everyone. It's this really fantastic, like, recursive game playing that's going on with the minds of the Special Circumstances unit being the actual players who are doing all of this. Incredible.
Yeah. And also the ship that was supposed to be disarmed
is actually armed.
Is not, right? Yeah. Like, the only thing that was true is, like, how fast the ship would get there.
Yeah.
Like, that's about it.
Well, and it's also a thing where, like, Special Circumstances has introduced this knowledge to the upper echelons of the Azad, right? Because they know that this fear and paranoia they have, because they're so obsessed with domination and control, will drive their city or their civilization to destruction, especially when they have the pressure of Gurga showing up, right? Like it makes them scared of, like, oh, he must be so great because he's from this amazing culture, but also they realize how insignificant they are, but they can't tell anybody because they're just trying to keep this system of domination going.
And the ambassador, Za, was the one who engineered that attack on him along with the drone, right? To make it seem like that as well. And when he was on the ship, he was like, well, I never saw any guns. And they were like, yeah, as you walked, we just rotated the hull.
It's like this really cool machine where he's like, he's inspecting all the cavities in the ship, but the ship is actually reconfiguring itself as he's walking along to just put him into the same cavity 3 times.
Yeah, they're like, oh, this ship isn't that smart. Like, don't worry about it. But, like, he got completely played. And yeah, even, like, the blackmail at the beginning, like, that is such a standard, spy work maneuver.
Yeah.
To, like, play to people's pride and then just be like, oh, I got you. But
you got handled.
So, I mean, to finish that one off, though, like, from the ashes of this burnt castle, they just leave. They just get up and go and fly home. Gurga stays in cryostasis for the whole journey home, meets his friends, all this kind of shit. The narrator gives us the outro, and it turns out that the narrator was Mawhrin-Skel, who is Mawhrin-Skel. Even the entire blackmail plot was a fucking ruse. Because, like, the Mawhrin-Skel, in quotes, accompanied him on this entire fucking trip as Mawhrin-Skel. The trick is, Fleur is a very small drone, and the whole thing is like, well, if he'd bothered to inspect the carcass of Mawhrin-Skel, he would have realized that it fits perfectly into the cavity where Mawhrin's mind, in quotes, would have been, so it's just like, Mawhrin just popped his brain out and flew around, to, like... So, playing a very long game. There's also, like, a question of, like, has Gurga been raised for this purpose, essentially? Because, like, Mawhrin-Skel has been friends with him for a while. That is a long fucking game to play if you're keeping up that ruse. There's a chance that he was actually engineered for this position. Like they cultivated him as the best game player ever over the course of 70 years to just flatten this fucking empire for them.
Yeah, because they know they go into some detail, not a bit, but some detail about how one of his friends back home switched sexes a couple times, had a child, and she was currently picking out the gene code. I think my kid's gonna be really good at X and Y and Z and stuff like that. So I think that's like another head nod to like maybe Gurga. They were just like, okay, who pumped out a baby that would be really good at being like addicted to games and good at like all this kind of stuff. Who knows what the time span of their work is, which is another cyberpunk omnipresence puppeteering stuff thing.
I mean, like Chambliss could be in on it, like his other drone buddy. Like anyone could realistically be in on this. Really cool. Cool story.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about, like, to what extent, like, Mawhrin is actually as bloodthirsty as he makes himself seem earlier in the story.
I think that seems like an act, yeah. It seems too cartoonish to be real.
Well, but he did kill the Emperor, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
Well, and we should say, too, that on his like briefing back or whatever, right? He was like, so whatever happened to them? They were like, oh, their society imploded, of course, right? Which is kind of like, I mean, how much better is it to? Well, I don't know. It's very imperialistic in that sense, but like, how much better is it to do that to a society than to like go to war with them? And obviously, they were worried in going to war with them, it would change the culture in the same way that the misfits of the people that puppeteered him have become changed. They were worried that all of their society might be changed by doing war with them. So it's like,
it's about limiting damage, right? Limiting blowback.
Yeah, it's very morally gray / bad, at least.
Oh, very much so. To raise somebody for their whole life just to do this op is pretty rough. And there is that line that Mawhrin-Skel has, like, where he says that, like, the faster you think, the slower time moves, and I think very fast indeed. Like, that like sort of like brings home how like sinister. The 70-year op must have been just glacial for somebody like that. Yeah,
it is very sinister because it gives
pretty pissed off.
It gives you a glimpse at how powerful the minds are. And like it's that theme of like, you know what, life in the culture is pretty fucking excellent for the organic and inorganic beings alike that inhabit it. However, there is this very odd sort of conspiracy at the heart of it that is kind of distasteful, you know?
Yeah. Well, and there's also an allusion to the idea that Gurga is different in that he's one of the only people that doesn't consider swapping his sex ever.
Right.
He's very possessive of other people.
Yep.
And I can't remember, I don't know if you guys do. Do you remember if at the end of the book, when they give the epilogue, yada, 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 eventually he died, did he end up changing his sex? Like, was that a plot point of being like, and he changed and now he's not so possessive and shitty and stuff like that?
I think he's still referred to as a he at that point. I can actually look at it.
Yeah, because that was the weird thing too. Like, even other people, his friends were like, you're weird, Gurga. Like, why wouldn't you want to experience the other sex?
Yeah, he's a stick in the mud, you know, for not doing that. No, he's a he at the end. Yeah.
Okay, so didn't change that much. Well, or didn't use that to telegraph it anyway.
Certainly.
Who knows?
I think there is a sense, like, you don't actually get a lot out of the last couple of chapters, the last chapter or two. He just sort of sees his buddies again and is a little bit emo about it, sort of, but doesn't show it a whole lot, you know? But I mean, no, his relationship with EA, his lady buddy, changes in such a way that implies that he's improved as a person from the experience.
But that in total, his purpose is done, and then he goes to be dead, right? Like, he chooses to die soon after, basically, which is, yeah, I think points to, again, how the culture is, like, not the best.
It's pretty crass, you know, in that, in the sort of way. It leaves you wondering how prevalent all this sort of stuff is. Like, that, are special circumstances just, like, fucking with everyone? Are the minds, like, playing games with everyone? Or is it that, by and large, the average citizen just sort of lives 300 or 400 years just, like, high as a kite and, like, eating nice things and just sort of wandering about in meadows and is just sort of well looked after? And very occasionally they do have to intervene to, like, set up this kind of weird shit to get things done. Or maybe it's more prevalent, I don't know.
I think that the idea of playing games with everyone is probably pretty apt, because the impression you definitely get in, like, reading Accession is that the minds can be pretty serious about things, but they're also very goofy, right? Like, they are very playful, and they... Yeah, like, I just keep coming back to the analogy that basically people are like pets to them. Like, they don't like consider them like meat or for the grinder or something. It's more just like, oh, like, aren't they cute? Like, and like oh, we like having them around, you know, like, and so yeah, they play with their pets, you know. That's kind of how it works.
Yeah, I was thinking as well that, like, the culture is obviously a sort of culture of minds, but also of, like, just colossal bodies. That, like, these minds inhabit bodies the size of, like, space stations and, like, ring worlds and this sort of stuff. And that, like, what must that subjectivity be like to have millions of these lice essentially living on your body and talking to them all the time, you know? Because, like, the Gurga converses with the mind of the he converses with the mind of the world he lives on, the ring world, and also with, like, sub-facets of it. It's like when you call a support hotline and you get through to the frontline operator, and then they patch you through to the real one or whatever, and it's like, oh boy, like, from the perspective of the minds, what must that be like? You know, that kind of subjectivity must be kind of incredible. Imagine being the size of a world, like, just this gigantic swole dude who has, like, all these little pets living on him, you know?
Yeah. And I really liked that it, like, interrogates a little bit how we think about technology. I think especially in 1988, right, before things got really moving, it's kind of like also saying that Azad and other games and stuff are technology that repurpose our minds, and the way that we interact with things shapes things more than we know and feel, basically. Like, so it was really interesting. And then 4 years later, Snow Crash comes out, right, and is the whole, like, knowledge is a virus, Tower of Babel, that kind of stuff. So it's interesting that I think it's far more effective detailing it in this book, because it's such a grander way of showing it and like telegraphing that to the audience, in that his entire way of interacting with the game changes as well as he consumes the culture, right? It was really cool.
Yeah, it's like the centerpiece, right?
Yeah, it was interesting that like, I even looked to see if anyone was categorizing the book as cyberpunk, and nobody had been. And it's weird because it's dead center in first wave cyberpunk too, right? So I think it's just interesting that the only thing that really separates it is the aesthetic of cyberpunk that isn't really
it kind of
like
shows
all
up.
It does show up. It's even there in that. It's just that the characters and how overt it is in cyberpunk isn't present in this, but yet this is kind of a better way of explaining some of the larger concepts of cyberpunk in a space opera, which I thought it was really neat.
Yeah, that is super cool. Like, It's really interesting because it is coming out of a similar time with just a different approach that didn't necessarily get developed as much as Cyberpunk, didn't blow up as much as Cyberpunk. But maybe worth revisiting. I think I just come back to that point about this is a book, as you said, that sort of really engages with these ideas of technology and language and games as structures and systems that change who we are and manipulate our social reality, and has all this social critique about capitalism and misogyny, imperialism, and it's the bunch of the tech bros, they read these books and it's just nothing.
They just think cool robots.
It's just oh yeah, cool robots, swole space stations, sexy times, lots of drugs. Yeah. It's all great.
It's the people that say that Cyberpunk isn't political, right?
Right. Totally. Yeah. It's just. Yeah, because Banks, or sorry, not Banks. It's total mix-up. Elon Musk named his rockets after culture stuff,
Christ.
right?
Yeah. Oh no!
That's how much this series was an influence on him, and
how?
It's just
how could he not fucking
just
this?
Missed everything. It's
yeah. Jesus.
So. Yeah, it forms a small part of the California ideology, I guess, as it is today. But for those of us who actually bother reading the book and what it says, we might get something different out of it. I think it does. It does present an image of the future that is kind of sinister in the sense that people are very much just part of these games of these minds. But there's a couple things about the series that do seem still optimistic to me. Is one, a lot of these minds do actually care about people, and another is these minds were made by people at some point way in the distant past, and they've kind of surpassed humanity, or they definitely have surpassed humanity, and have sort of integrated humanity into their structures and their lives. But it's not the Terminator scenario, right? It's not, the machines showed up and then they killed us all, right?
It's not, this is peak technophobia in 88.
Yeah,
he's all but maybe this is cool, actually.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
My sort of maybe theory on that is that, for the minds, they live in such, material abundance that there's really nothing they could get in terms of exploitation by actually exploiting this living beings, except for this case where they can get some socio-political or geopolitical or whatever galaxy political outcome from fucking them over. But ordinarily, what could you as a human being offer to a mind in terms of exploitation that they would ever want?
Yeah. They have to gamify people.
Yeah, well, they can manipulate matter at a fundamental level. They can manipulate quantum mechanics. I don't think there's anything they can extract from a person that is of any value to them, except for companionship or some higher ideal of post-human humanism or whatever. So I think that's maybe a factor. It is certainly still sinister, though. There is sinister undertones to this, but I'm in agreement that it remains overall optimistic.
Yeah, I think so. Is it, do we know, maybe Kyle knows from reading all the books, do we know if the culture people originally made the mines, or...
It's kept fairly vague, but yeah, that's kind of the implication is that the creation of the mines was sort of a part of a very long process of social engineering, basically they had a progressive vision in mind, and they started hacking their language and hacking their machines and all that kind of thing to gradually realize the sorts of societies and sorts of people they wanted to become.
And then started giving more and more power and agency to until they had, until it,
Yeah, but like it's also like important to remember that like the minds were hacked in the same language that they were engineering to create, like to recreate themselves, like literally at a physical level, right? So like it's like the process definitely outstripped the people, but like the development of the people and the development of the minds were kind of coextensive with each other. They're all part of this long process of like evolution and like metamorphosis.
Yeah, that's cool shit. Yeah. Is there anything else we need to cover?
I guess there's one thing I would say that like is kind of like, this is just to revisit the topic, but that is kind of sinister about the culture that I think is worth mentioning, is that like there's definitely a certain amount of like ableism that is in the culture, and where like they say like that as part of their like genetic engineering they've like removed all possibility of being like crippled or of having birth defects or like of any kind of like any kind of disability, right? And I know, like, that, especially if you are somebody who has this as a fact of your life, like, the idea that, like, people like you in the future are just going to be erased from existence is a little bit sinister, right? So, like, I know Banks was very much coming at it from, like, a sort of, like, trying to portray it in a positive light, but that's a big blind spot of science fiction that I think this book also definitely, like, falls into, so just thought I'd bring that up.
It's prevalent in male authors, I think, too, right, who don't get, like, embodiment issues at all, right? Like for the male, just like in Cyberpunk, the best thing, like, the ultimate thing is to jack into something and lose your body, whereas for women they understand embodiment in a much different lens than males, right? They give birth, it's usually in cyberpunk fiction, no female protagonist is going to be like, oh shit, my arm got chopped off and now I have a cybernetic limb, but doesn't matter, this one's better or whatever, right? Whereas the male protagonists are always like that. They're just like, I'm even better. I can turn this into taking out the corporation, and I couldn't do that with my meat arm, right? Like, meat space is sucky. And so I think it's just a prevailing kind of male authorship problem in sci-fi.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this definitely gets back to the stuff we talked about in the Xenofeminist Manifesto episode, right? Like that, like, yeah, we don't want to really make appeals to like women's nature as like, oh, like they must, or like oh yeah, like the female embodied experience is what defines being female. But definitely it is the case that like in the fiction, like that is a divide that exists, right? Like that.
Yeah, it's a through line that I think a gender studies person could tackle, but for me it's just I notice male authors don't handle embodiment well and female generally do. Mm-hmm. That's all I can speak to intelligently about.
Yeah, and I mean that is like definitely a part of like that whole like Californian ideology and everything we talked about in the past of like transcending the flesh and that kind of stuff, whereas you can think about like in somewhat different ways than perhaps like eliminating all physical disabilities, about like biohacking and that kind of thing, which is like treating this kind of like cyberpunky topics in an embodied way. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions. This is a very old book, but it is worth reading. It is worth talking about. Yeah,
it is approximately 1,000% better than the first one.
Yeah, don't bother with that first one. Yeah, I think
there's a review for the back of the cover.
Yeah,
yeah, I got the gist.
Yeah, I think I don't know if we mentioned it on the episode or was it in the green room, but like maybe this one's a good intro to the series in general, and then maybe after that Accession. Real good stuff. Yeah,
and there's a lot of other books in the series that are just kind of weird. which are also worth reading. But if you want to get, like, what is the culture, Player of Games and Accession are good ones to touch on.
Yeah, fun. We might get around to an Accession episode someday. It'd be a fun distraction.
Oh yeah, I plan on it for sure. It's worth looking at.
So yeah, thanks listeners for entertaining us on this one. And if you'd like to keep up with us in the meantime, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit, and you can find us on all the podcast apps. You know, the like, rate, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. And if you've been enjoying the show, maybe think of going to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit to throw us a couple of bucks a month and to, you know, pay for books and hosting costs and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, Fraser, do you have anything you'd like to plug? We tend to give the guest the last word.
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Fraser Simons and pretty much everywhere at Fraser Simons. I publish a lot, well, maybe not a lot, but I publish a few role-playing games, mainly in the cyberpunk genre. So you can find those. I do a blog called Consuming Cyberpunk that's, you guessed it, all about cyberpunk. And I think that's about it. If you like tabletop games, you'll probably like my feed.
Yeah, fabulous. So yeah, thanks again, listeners, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks with, some non-fiction stuff. Thanks for listening again, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.